Thank you, Dr. Maloney, Professor Maloney. It's really very nice to present a paper. There was one line in a textbook on history which said, the Dutch and the Danes were also there. And that was it. And so that was very intriguing for me. We know a lot about, when we study Indian history in Indian universities, we learn a lot about the English in India. And of course, we get to learn a lot about the Portuguese. To a little bit, we get to learn about the French. But the Dutch and Danes are really ones that we didn't get to know about. At least 15 years ago, that was definitely the situation. And since then, we have come a long way. Also thanks to a large part of Lennart Besse's sources, guide on sources. And the results of the changes in Indian history, which you see happening now in the last 10 years with several publications, are part of the outcome of this kind of attempt to conserve archival documents as well as popularize them and ensure that historians would use it. So what I'm going to do in today's paper is, instead of presenting my own volume on the Dutch in Cochin, so I wrote a book, my PhD thesis was about Fort Cochin, and I wrote a sort of an intimate history on many biographies, many personalities, and how the Dutch functioned in India and how they survived after a defeat in a battle, and how they continued to live in India. Now, starting with economic history, we have, using the archives, Binu John Mela Parambil, who worked on the Ali Rajas of Kannanur, has significantly altered our understanding of how the small port cities functioned. Not only on the relationship between the heads of state and various merchant groups that function within Kannanur, but also the coming of what is referred to as the new kids on the block, or the Europeans who came and started to trade and demand more and more of the regional products. The growing power of the Ali Raja in the regional political economy remained almost unchallenged until the VOC, the EIC, and the English private traders began to make their presence felt in the regional market and set about appropriating a share in the local trade. From the documents that are available of the VOC, we can see many different names of people and places and in between people who work as people who provide the different commodities that the VOC or other Europeans were interested in. So the go-betweens of the merchant community who provided the different commodities that the VOC was interested in getting from the coast of Malabar. The Mapilas of Kolathunadu, who were earlier segregated as a religious group, should be conceived as a professional commercial jati, which fitted rather well in the Malabar social structure. So you can look at different communities within the Malabar coast from sources that have been used a lot by the that are available of the English. But when you look at the Dutch sources, historians have concluded that actually you should not be looking at Mapilas as only a religious group, but you see how active they are in functioning with the political heads as well as the different mercantile communities, indigenous as well as foreign, and that you should actually look at them as a professional commercial jati. Now, the Dutch were in Malabar mostly for pepper, but they also exported rice, slaves, textiles, turmeric, cardamom, timber, wild cinnamon, and several coconut products. There are two kinds of trade that we can very generically speak about. One, which was material that was collected from the Malabar specifically to be sent to the Netherlands for consumption in Europe and trade in Europe. And the second was those materials which were collected for the intra-Asian trade. So a lot of the VOC was able to actually function with high levels of profit in competition with the European and the almost declining Portuguese and French and Danish traders who were also in India by coming up with this idea of intra-Asian trade, by which they picked up textiles from India in order to exchange for spices in Indonesia. And they had this kind of intricate exchange going on all over Asia, and they had mastered the shipping routes by which at a certain moment the Dutch no longer needed to bring in silver from Europe in order to get the commodities from Asia. They were able to generate it from within Asia as well. And Malabar played a very important role in providing pepper for this trade. The VOC were not only collecting commodities for exporting them out of Malabar, but also they were importing several commodities within Malabar, in which opium and sugar appear high on the list, as well as Japanese copper, cotton, horses, elephants, and other spices. So within the regional trade of the Malabar coast, of the Arab Peninsula, of the island of Ceylon and Indonesia, you see that a lot of commodities are being exchanged exchanged by the Dutch in the Malabar coast. So another note on how the use of Dutch sources has altered our understanding of economic history is perhaps one which I felt, because of course I did the research on it, I felt which was most significant was that the Dutch describe themselves, so historians who work in the Netherlands and look at the Dutch overseas history, they describe themselves as merchant warriors in India. So they were not colonizers, they were merchant warriors. So the English were colonizers, but the Dutch were simply existent here as merchant warriors. And after they lost the battle in 1743, the term the merchant warrior pacified was sort of put forward. What I did was I looked into the account books of the Dutch in Malabar, specifically of the headquarters in Cochin, and I realized that majority of the so-called profits of the VOC were not actually profits from trading, the import and export of the local account books, but they were taxes that were levied on certain commodities which the VOC considered as their monopoly, but also on land which the VOC had managed to conquer through different treaties and negotiations. So in many ways, the VOC was a landlord in Malabar and functioning as a sovereign, imposing taxes on trade as well as on land. So then you can't call them merchants, and I could still couldn't really call them colonizers, because we are talking about the part of the 18th century. So I settled on the concept of proto-colonizers. So in many ways, the Dutch in Malabar in the 1750s are comparable to the English in Bengal. So the permanent settlement that is happening in Bengal in the 1750s is pretty much happening in Malabar by the Dutch in the 1750s and 60s. And similar work has been done to show how the VOC functioned in very comparable ways in Indonesia around the same time. So Remco Rabun and Ulbe Bosma have been working on these beginnings of permanent settlement-like features. So you can see that using the VOC archives, we can talk a lot about the economic as well as political history and our understanding of various European entities that functioned in India in the early modern period. Now moving on to the social history, again this was something that I felt was very important. Growing up in India, we knew a lot about the English and the social life of the English, and we knew a little bit about the Portuguese as well. Pius Malikandathil has worked a lot on the Portuguese in Cochin, and during my master's years, the book of William Dalrymple called White Mughals became very popular, and that really sort of showed how Europeans, it became a prototype of what a European or a British or a Scotsman, actually specifically speaking, functioned in India in early modern times, how they had become Nawabs and how they had gone totally local and used very indigenous ways of dressing and communicating and lifestyle and marrying Indian women and attaching themselves to the elites in India in order to make their careers, and also it shaped their personal lives as well and family histories as well. And I never found a Dutch Mughal, which I hoped I would in the archives, but I never found a love story between a Dutch man and an Indian elite or a woman from Malabar. But I did find many different life histories of men who were in the first generation born in the Netherlands and came to Cochin as VOC servants, and within the first 2 or 3 years, if they survived and did not die of a disease, of a tropical disease, ended up marrying many Indo-Portuguese women. So these were women who were born from Portuguese men who had come to India, and there were no European women at all at that time. So they ended up marrying the local Malabar women, and their children, who were already Catholic Christians, the VOC ended up marrying these women to set up homes in Cochin and other smaller settlements. So the book on Fort Cochin basically tells you a lot about these marriage patterns, baptism, how the VOC men, although they were of the Dutch Reformed Church and were forbidden to be Catholics or marry Catholics, actually married Catholic women in Cochin and got their children baptized as well. A lot of these men were benefited tremendously from the social network that these women had, because these women were very well embedded in the Malabar milieu, and they had a whole network of relations within Malabar, spanning within the Indo-Portuguese community as well as the Mestizo community as well as the indigenous community through generations of living here and having family and commercial networks over here. And my book has shown how several of these VOC men sort of formed a group of people, and how they helped each other move up the career ladder by marrying, in some cases, very rich widows who had been married to other prominent men in the VOC. So the history of the Dutch in Cochin led to a renewed interest in the social history of the Europeans in India and the process of identity formation as well. While officially the VOC followed a policy of selective inclusion and exclusion, so depending on what suited them, they would include people as part of their European or Dutch identity, or they would say no, they are indigenous people. In reality, the people in and around Fort Cochin were interconnected and codependent. The mestizo, that is people of mixed background, or tupasas, the go-between communities, narrowed the distance between those living inside the fort and those outside of it. These conclusions, of course, again have been corroborated by other researches which have been done on the British, the Portuguese, and the Dutch in other parts of Asia as well. The VOC attempts at racial and ethnic engineering did not really work at the boundary, as the boundaries between people were porous and permeable, leading to creolization and mesticization. There were local VOC dynasties which were formed into what came to be known as the Indo-Dutch community. And I must say over here that I never used the word Indo-Dutch community in my book, but Lennart has formed an Indo-Dutch history paper, a Facebook page, and that attracts a lot of attention. And although I use the word Indo-Portuguese, but somehow while I was writing my thesis, I don't use the word Indo-Dutch, and I'm surprised at myself why I don't do it, because what I have created in those 300 pages is actually the history of the Indo-Dutch community, and that would have been a far better title for my book than what it eventually ended up happening. But anyway, the Indo-Dutch community, which is now an established community among scholars who work on the Europeans in India, is very much comparable to the Indo-Portuguese or the Anglo-Indian communities about whom we know much more. Moving to, so these are the kinds of impact that, or new interpretations of histories that one can see when one uses a set of archives, which is very different from other archives that, that historians use. Coming to the political history section, again, the work of Binu John Mela Parambul has greatly altered our understanding of the Ali Rajas of Kannanur, as well as the Mappilas. His book is titled Lords of the Sea, and he has demonstrated that concepts like segmentary state and the little kingdom are insufficient for capturing the political reality of early modern Malabar. He shows that fluid networks of personal relations were more important than territorial sovereignty. The Dutch were not powerful in the realm of the Ali Rajas, yet they were very much rooted at Fort St. Angelo, and the amount of material that they collected in order to be informed and in order to have some kind of an influence into the courts of these local kingdoms has given us, as Lennart has, of course, very nicely demonstrated through the PowerPoint, to show that how much information the VOC collected on the Malabar region as well. And through these, you can rewrite the entire histories of several of these kingdoms. The book of Hugo Jacob on the Rajas of Cochin, which is, of course, based on the idea of segmentary state, again has shown how only using the VOC archives you can reconstruct the entire dynastic history or the political history of the Rajas of Cochin, including what are the powers that come into play when there is a change in the generation, and what are the factors which are most important when the next ruler is chosen. So, for example, Binu John and Hugo Jacob, both of them agree that it is not the idea of a sovereign state and the head of the state which is important when it comes to a dynasty or a kingdom, but the networks that are established and a decision which is made within the larger family or the Swarupam on who is going to be the next head of state. So the political idea of a sovereign and a sovereign state is not important, the boundaries are not important, but the personal networks and the influence of various members of that family plays a very important role in deciding who is going to succeed next. So, in terms of also political history, again, I think I spoke a little bit ahead of my time in saying that I tried to alter our understanding of what exactly, how do we define the Dutch in India, doing a case study of the Cochin. And again, in terms of political history over here, I would say that that conclusion does hold water, that the VOC very much was functioning as a political factor, and had it not been stopped by the English and because of the upheavals that took place in Napoleonic Europe and the settlements of the VOC had not been taken over by the English, the VOC or the Dutch would pretty much have emerged as a political power, or at least remained as a political power in India, the way the Portuguese had remained in Goa and the French had remained in Pondicherry. So this is a bit of a speculative history over here, but this is what, from the readings, I would say that there were certain events that ensured that the Malabar coast was taken over by the English, but the Dutch were otherwise very well settled there and very much on a path of colonization of Malabar, the way the Portuguese were in Goa, and the English in Bengal, and the French in Pondicherry. So it is because of the Anglo-Dutch rivalry which was being played out in Europe and other parts of the world where the Dutch and the English were competing with each other that ultimately Malabar was lost for the VOC. And it's very important to say over here that one of the ideas that came to me while doing research is that why since the 1950s, when a lot of research was being done on the nationalist kind of histories were written and the Europeans were discussed on several different levels in our history writing, why were the Dutch and the Danes left out of this entire discussion? Because of course there were several scholars who were aware of this, especially as the Dutch as trading entities, they were all aware of it from the earlier generations of Ashan Gupta and Professor Om Prakash and R.S. Ratnam. They were all writing about the Dutch and using those sources. When the English took over the VOC fort in Cochin, they systematically bombarded and destroyed all the fortifications of the Dutch. So there was nothing that the Dutch could claim back later on, if there was peace and there were going to be negotiations. And because nothing of the fort remains, none of the fort walls remain, there are some houses that remain, and there is the Dutch graveyard that remains in Cochin. And because there is no memory, there is no visible heritage that people could, something tangible that people could see and research, therefore I feel that one of the things you really see the importance of cultural heritage, that the history writing about the Dutch in Cochin has remained very, very marginal. When we go to Sri Lanka, you see that much more is written and researched about, because the Dutch fortresses in Sri Lanka pretty much exist now and are in very good condition. But a very beautiful and large fort of the Dutch in Cochin was totally destroyed by the English because they wanted to remove it from the memory of the people, and they wanted to ensure that the Dutch would never come back to claim anything. And therefore, I think in some sense, we did go through a phase of a loss of history, which is now being rewritten. So we see that the VOC, although in earlier generations where the Dutch were written as people who were functioning on the coast, on the peripheries, and as merchants, from new records we can see that the process of territorialization based on taxation, both on land and land occupation, was pretty much happening in India, as has been showed about the VOC in Java as well as in Ceylon in the 18th century. So if I've not convinced you now about the relevance of Dutch sources, let me just wrap up by saying that using the Dutch sources not only helps us answer familiar questions of why and how in history, but also of why then and why there. My research on Fort Cochin was limited to the higher ranks of the local 600 to 700 VOC personnel. And this is now where I want to reflect upon what more can be done using the VOC archives. So being self-critical, I could say that of the remaining 1,200 to 1,500 Dutch community or Indo-Dutch community, as Van Leeuwen would have labeled, they remain in gray and are undifferentiated. So while my book talks about the governor generals and some of the elite people, there are many more people whose history can be written about. More research can and should be done on the mestizo and slave society, and it is indeed very heartening to see that younger scholars, and today they are going to present some of the work on the topic of slave trade, which also the VOC took in. And I'm very eager to hear about some of their findings. On the early Rajas of Cannanore and the Kolatari and the Rajas of Cochin, one can imagine fascinating comparative or connected histories being written when one compares the ways in which the Dutch and the Portuguese meddled in the process of state formation and how they tried to exert influence as merchants and kingmakers. So we have some monographs on the role of the Portuguese, now emerging monographs on the role of Dutch, and perhaps some comparative work on how the Dutch and the Portuguese function perhaps in similar ways or different ways in meddling with the state formation process would be very exciting. Similarly, expanding the scope of Asian-European interactions in the early modern period, further research on Malabar can be undertaken on the parallels between the functioning of the Dutch in South Asia, including Ceylon and Southeast Asia, that is present-day Indonesia, and the Far East, Japan and Taiwan. the digitization of the VOC records, which Lennart explained in his presentation very well, is making it all very much possible to do this kind of research. Thank you.